The way that you know if you're in a narcissistic relationship is how you feel in the relationship, your experience in the relationship. So it's about what's so hard to do in a relationship with a narcissist is trust our gut and listen to our inner voice.
And so I want to ask you about that. Like, you have been a practitioner for a long time. What's your experience with like trying to find a decent therapist, trying to, get to a point where you recognize I need to work on this stuff that I keep trying to protect? How do you, what is your experience with that? And what would you recommend for people in that, dealing with that?
I am so glad you asked that question because I skipped to the part where I found the right therapist.
Yeah.
There were multiple times before then, particularly very early in my marriage, when I felt something was wrong or I was uncomfortable with. I will never forget. I went to a therapist. It was so hard for me to talk about it because it's embarrassing. So the shame and guilt were just through the roof.
Yeah.
And I went into the therapist's office and I said, you know what, I'm going to do this because I want to fix this. I want to keep my marriage and I want to fix this. I told the therapist what I was dealing with. And she said, well, why are you still with him? Why don't you just leave? And I thought, this isn't for me.
Yeah.
That's not helpful.
Yeah.
What am I going to do with that? That is so not helpful. So unfortunately, there are therapists out there who don't have the skill set. There are billions of beautiful, amazing therapists.
Yeah.
But we're human.
Yeah.
We're all human. And so not every therapist is for everybody. It is so important to stick with it. When that first therapist wasn't right for me, it took me a step back or two. But because of my field and I believe in it, I said, she's not the one. I've got to find somebody else. So, a little bit later, I tried someone else. And so it was a progress. It was a process, I should say.
Yeah.
And I really want to encourage people to see it as a process and give that first therapist a try. If you don't feel a connection after 2 or 3 sessions, unless you feel something egregious is happening, then you have options, but don't give up. Don't give up on you.
And I think one of the things I love in your book is you've got definitions of a lot of different terms and ideas that play into the narcissistic abuse. And one thing that I wanted to talk a little bit about is, when somebody hears about like severe narcissistic abuse, there's this tendency to say, well, I'm not experiencing that, so this must not be narcissism. And you talked earlier about how it's on a spectrum. You can get like really severe narcissism on one end, and then you've got kind of our natural tendencies towards self-centeredness on the other end. And there's a whole spectrum in there.
Exactly.
And you talked about things like codependency and so when part of the reason why I was so excited to talk to you is because I think when people struggle with mental health challenges like bipolar, there is a increased probability that you may end up in a unhealthy relationship and you even end up in a narcissistic abusive relationship. That was actually one of the things that triggered my initial symptoms was the narcissistic abuse in my first marriage. So how would somebody go about identifying, like, what would you recommend if somebody's struggling and they start to resonate with some things that you're talking about and not with other things, and they're not really sure, like, am I in a narcissistic relationship? Is this codependency? Are these things that are affecting me? When there's this, like, well, it's not that bad, so it must not be. Do you know what I'm talking about? Like, how do you help people recognize whether or not they're dealing with those things and start to take their power back?
Right. This comes up a lot in my support groups. And what I say to try to make it as clear and simple as possible. I say this all the time. We are not here to diagnose the narcissist. We are not here to diagnose your spouse, your partner, your mother or father. The way that you know if you're in a narcissistic relationship is how you feel in the relationship, your experience in the relationship. So it's about what's so hard to do in a relationship with a narcissist is trust our gut and listen to our inner voice. That gets shut down, suppressed in the relationship. So we are conditioned through the manipulation in this relationship to think we're the problem or this is normal, which is what my situation was. This is what couples do. This is, when you're married for this amount of time, this is just what happens. I've never been married before. So I'm like, okay, well, let's work on it then. So, it's very difficult to see outside of their delusional thinking because the part of the manipulation is them making sure, manipulating us into seeing things their way and only their way. So it's not about diagnosing them. Right. It's about listening to yourself. When it comes to a covert narcissist in particular, that's where I get the most questions in terms of, well, how do I know? Because sometimes they are and sometimes they're not. Yeah. You will most often see, and actually a part of the definition that I share in my groups is, after I read the definition, I say, most consistently present in relationships. Yeah. So the narcissist, as we know, wears a mask. And so particularly the covert narcissist, they're humble, they're generous, they're kind. The covert narcissist is very concerned about how people perceive them. Yeah. And so they are going to mask and cater to their audience. So we can't go by how they are interacting outside of the relationship. What is your experience inside within your four walls of the relationship? Yeah. After you have experienced what we call the idealizing stage, where the love bombing and soulmate scam and the mirroring and masking, all that stuff that we are like, oh, this is it. Yeah. Then when we get to the devaluing stage where it's like, something is off. They don't normally act this way or treat me this way. That thought that goes, that first initial feeling, or maybe multiple times you felt this doesn't feel right. Because of the idealizing stage, we are more likely to forgive, justify, rationalize, excuse, overlook. Well, it's because their childhood. Well, it's because of their previous relationship. They were hurt really bad and now they're very this and that. We, the empathetic ones whom a narcissist is attracted to, are more likely to forgive. Right. So back to answering your question, it is our experience in the relationship. And when we are ready to come out of denial, the next time we feel something is off, we listen. It's like, I can't ignore this anymore. That's how we know. And then we begin to seek help. Then we begin to want to just, okay, what is this? What's happening to me? That's when we find podcasts and when we find social media and when we find support groups. We're looking for validation. Yeah. All that is about looking for validation because you're not going to get it in the relationship.